Hello, everyone. This is the New World Geopolitics March 19th, 2024 frontline and geopolitical update for the Russo-Ukrainian war. There's a lot to talk about. There's some movement in some different areas on the front line, and we're going to talk a bit about Russian elections as well as Western funding and support for Ukraine at the end of the video. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in and get a rush through this. First, we're going to go to the southern sector of the front. This is in the Zaporizhia region. And the last video, we talked about how the Russians had once again tried to enter into Robotny, have taken over some of the southern defenses of that town. We do not have any additional updates there. It seems like the situation is more or less in the deadlock. And I mean, there's generally an overall reduced uh, presence of Russian assaults across the front line. And we're going to see this story in several different locations, but first we're going to, go through them individually. We do have information of Russian movement near Guliaipol. I don't think that this is anything major, any kind of major Russian attacks. One of the bigger announcements is the capture of the town of Marne. This is actually interesting because I already have this as under Russian control. As you can see, that was already there. Some mapping sources are claiming that it wasn't. It seems to me like Marne was maybe in the gray zone. There might have been some small Ukrainian presence there, or maybe the Ukrainians had moved in and the Russians had pushed them back out. Either way, that's kind of, we've seen that several points during the war from the Ukrainians or for the Russians where, they claim a victory, capturing a settlement that really, they already controlled. So I think that's kind of what you're seeing here. South of Guliaipo and north of Marfapil, the Russians have moved in and taken over some control of the gray zone. Uh, Once again, it just doesn't seem like the situation where there was hard, massed mechanized battles for this zone. It seems like kind of just positional assaults. If anything, maybe even just the Russians moving into former positions that were abandoned by the Ukrainians. But there's a river, a creek bed that runs through here. So it kind of forms a natural barrier between the Russians and the Ukrainian positions. Moving on to the area of Novomihailovka, we don't really have any updates from Novomihailovka. This is one of the places where the Russian efforts have stalled, whether it's, they can't make any more progress or they're kind of taking a break or a lull in the fighting to get reorganized for a new push. It's tough to really tell there, but the settlement seems to be about somewhere within the 50-50 range of half under Russian control, half under Ukrainian control. Something we actually missed in the previous update near Pobeda, the Russians did move up and capture a little bit more ground, trench network directly to I guess this is the west of the town, but other than that, there's still, no real movement in that area. The Russians have made some progress in Georgievka. Really, we're just talking about a tree line, some houses here, trying to break into, the meat of the settlement, the center of the settlement, but making very slow progress on that as well. I think one of the places where we've seen the most activity still, and this still isn't any kind of major combat activities. There's some discussion that these are big battles and very deadly battles taking place here, which I think they probably are pretty deadly. There's a lot of artillery, a lot of equipment being destroyed, but this is nowhere near to the scale of what was going on just a few weeks ago. So breaking that down, a little bit more movement in Tonenke, some more structures, some more tree lines taken under Russian control. The remainder of the settlement of Orlovka has fallen under Russian control as well. And then finally, with Berdichi, this is probably the most consequential of all of them to go over. The Russians have advanced up into this area here, which is kind of a crossroads. And if the Russians have some success here and end up cutting this, it will essentially split Ukrainian forces in this area to a defensive ring here and then a defensive ring here, meaning their logistics would come from two different directions. So that's kind of a troubling development for the Ukrainians in this particular town right here, which this is an advance. The Russians have made it up to this point before, and were pushed back by a Ukrainian counterattack. So we'll see how that develops in the coming weeks. To the north of the Avdiivka area, the Russians did end up falling back. As you can see, this is north of Krasnogorovka, north of Avdiivka. There were some tree lines and some trench networks that the Russians had control over. The Ukrainians have essentially pushed the Russians back to the rail line in this area. So generally we're seeing some Russian pressure throughout the front, mainly just on the Ukrainian side. I think there's some good takeaways here. This, in general, they've kind of balanced the front line and relieved some of the worst locations of, relieved the pressure. The situation has somewhat bettered for Ukraine. Whether that means that they can continue on in the future and continue having success on the defensive, it seems like maybe that is a stretch, but the Russians are not pursuing the same level of gains and advances that they were before. So that gives the Ukrainian army somewhat of a break. Real quick, talking about Bakhmut, Ivanovka. Since the Russians advanced and took over about a little over half the town, there hasn't been any more additional advances. It seems like the Ukrainians still have a couple good roads leading into the town from different directions, so they still got some supply. There's a built-up area to the south of the town that's a pretty good defensive position. Of course, the urban area here at the top, there's a lot of forests and hills that kind of protect Ukrainian logistics and stuff moving into the town there. So this is unlike the first part of Ivanovka, this will be a much tougher nut to crack. And the Ukrainians are probably looking to hold that off for as long as possible. And they really need to, in order to delay the Russians in the south, places like Klishchiivka, Ukrainian front lines down near Avdiivka. All of this would probably collapse pretty rapidly if the Russians moved up to the canal zone and took over this area. That means that all of Ukrainian weapons and logistics and reinforcements is going to have to move over the canal in different areas. They'll have to set up temporary bridges for that, mobile bridges, which can be targeted by Russian glide bombs, Russian artillery, and whatnot. So, holding off at Ivanovka, very important for holding on to this ground in the south. Because should Russia, the flip side of that, if the Ukrainians decide to abandon all of this area, it gives the Russians a good defensive barrier of the canal, and allows the Russians to remove large numbers of their troops from the area. The canal is very defensible, and they could repurpose those troops to other parts of the front, which is clearly not within Ukraine's interest there. So, all right. Finally, just a quick update before we move on to the border region. There is some progress here that was made near Terney. If you'll remember, there were some claims that the Russians had seized Terney, they'd seized Makivka. We have no evidence of either of that, but we do have finally some confirmation that the Russians have advanced right up to the outskirts of Terney. But once again, I'm not surprised by this development at all. Typically, when definite or when accurate information comes out, there's a lot more reliable sourcing on that, and this was kind of really unreliable, speculative, more rumor type information that the Russians had made it into and captured this town here. So that's the progress there. Now moving up north, I've kind of marked some of the areas where Ukraine is attacking the Russian border, and this is important to note. It seems like the purpose in this was the ongoing Russian presidential election. The Ukrainians were hoping to have some kind of effect, probably not some effect on the outcome, but just looking to embarrass or make Putin look bad that he couldn't defend his borders while voters were out at the voting booths. Ukrainian forces trying to move into Kozinka, the border region here. I don't really think I can map anything out definitively. This is just kind of where the combat the activity is going on, and then also trying to move into this small settlement here of Gorkovsky. At some point, the Ukrainians had actually managed to capture the bulk of the settlement, but then were forced out by Russian counterattacks. And, before we move on to Russian elections, the only other thing to note here is that recently Ukraine has given orders to evacuate more settlements from the front. So, another potential takeaway from this is typically before an offensive starts by one side or the other, like say when the Russians are about to start an offensive, the Ukrainians will preemptively make some strikes and make some attacks to try and shape the battlefield a little bit better in their favor. They'll take over some Russian forward, outposts and things just to make things more difficult for when the assault finally does come. And the Russians did the same things to the Ukrainians. Before the summer offensive of last year, the Russians made several minor advances along the Zaporozhye front line, just as they had done in the Kherson region before the Kherson offensive, and just as the Ukrainians have done in several locations. It's really hard to disguise and hide these offensives. There's so many drones operating over the battlefields. You can see troop movements. You can see where large the Ukrainians know where the rail lines are. They know where the Russian railroads are delivering tanks and supplies to. So it's possible that this could be some kind of preemptive shaping operation to a future Russian offensive towards Kharkov. It's also possible that this was just to take some of the pressure off the Donbass or put some pressure on Russia for the elections. It's all that speculation. It's just pointing out kind of a pattern that has formed in the past. Now, real quick, the Russian presidential election. We'll go ahead and zoom this out some so you guys can see it. Not a big surprise here. Vladimir Putin won the election. He didn't really have any competition. There was 3 other candidates, all got about 3 to 4% of the vote. This is kind of the big takeaway number here is the turnout was 77%, which is up almost 7% from the last election. So this is kind of one of the numbers that Russia looks at for legitimacy in their elections. I think the target is 65%, or perhaps it's even 70%. All the other candidates, the anti-war candidates like Boris Nadezhdin was actually banned from the ballot, and that's something looking at down here, and I it's kind of I can just visually see like big issues with the way this process works. You have to collect a certain number of signatures, 105,000 signatures to make it onto the ballot, and then the government reviews those signatures and can find places where some of them are invalid or disqualify specific signatures, meaning that after these 2 candidates, which this one's kind of funny because this candidate didn't even submit, it was 2 signatures shy of the required amount. And so like, why wouldn't you want to submit the exact 105,000 signatures? A large number of the signatures actually gets disqualified from the government, and the candidate can't run. Now, I think that when this process happens in the West, like in America, say if there's a threshold for, I don't know, like the state of California, you might have to have 800,000 signatures to be on the ballot. Or it's probably not that high, 200, 400,000 signatures to be on the ballot. A candidate can collect far more than that number of signatures, whereas it appears that in Russia, you can only submit 105,000 signatures to even get on the ballot, meaning that once those signatures are reviewed and they're disqualified, you're almost, if a single signature gets disqualified, or maybe there's some kind of threshold like if 104,000 out of the 105,000 are good, then you can still get on. I don't really know, but just the sheer fact that you cannot collect over the required amount, you have to submit the exact amount, is a clear issue in the way that process works. And I'm not saying that this is an illegitimate election. I think that Russia or Putin does have popular support within Russia. I just also it's pretty clear that there's definitely a motive to get anti-war candidates or pro-Western candidates more or less off the ballot, just to make sure that like say Boris Nadezhdin, if he'd ended up on the ballot, I don't think he would have won. But if he'd collected 10-20% of the vote, it would have revealed to the rest of the country that there is a large portion of the country that's anti-war. Or if this candidate here, um, communist candidate is probably more communist than the other candidate that was running. If he collects 10-15% of the vote, it kind of emboldens the communists that there might be more support to return to communism than there was. Right? Just all these. It's more or less about. It's not about winning, and it's more about the narrative, I think, in these Russian elections. But some interesting stuff going on there. Now, I want to real quick talk about aid to Ukraine. I think I discussed this a little bit in my last video, or maybe I imagined discussing it. But I think that there will be some more aid for Ukraine coming in, but it's kind of tough because the U.S. government wants more aid to go to Ukraine, or the current administration, but they want to run on that in their re-election campaign, right? So when they look at the numbers and how the public feels, 20% of the public wants more aid, 30% of the public thinks we've sent too much, and then 30% of the public thinks that it's just the right amount, or something like that. I'm almost positive I'd posted this in my last video, so some of you guys didn't see that, go back and watch that. But if by definition, the more aid that gets sent, this group that thinks we've sent just the right amount of aid is going to decrease in size, and they're going to move into, okay, now we've sent too much. So if an aid package gets passed before November, then it can't, the Biden administration cannot run on that as a re-election campaign, which is a big problem. So in the meantime, you're seeing Republicans say, oh, all of a sudden, okay, we're open to sending some money. They're not really open to sending some money. They're just saying that because they're kind of putting pressure on the Democrats, like we'll send a couple $1 billion, that way you can't run on this campaign. Just like with the border issues, how when the Democrats decided, oh, hey, we're going to put forward a border bill, you're right, we should fix the border. The Republicans are like, no, we're not going to vote for that because we want to run on it in November, right? So in the meantime, these smaller aid packages going to go through. This is through a process called Presidential Drawdown Authority. Essentially, the president has the authority to allocate existing military funds for unforeseen international emergencies. So these funds are coming directly from the military budgets of different military jurisdictions across the world. So specifically, it seems like the Europe and Asia Central Command is fronting this kind of money, and this is a bit misleading, but this says 300 million in savings used to fund military aid for Ukraine, will be used for replenishing weapons. And then international coalition trains 129,000 Ukrainian forces amid reports of ammunition storages. So when you read this, your initial thought is like, oh, so Ukraine is training another, a lot more soldiers, and they're training up a large army. When you go into the article and you start to read about where this funding comes from and where that number actually came from, you get down to here, to these two paragraphs is very important information. Funding to train Ukrainian forces is also at risk. The U.S. Army Regional Command for Europe and Africa, which is based in Germany, has spent more than $500 million out of its base budget so far this fiscal year to conduct the training, and expects to run out of money by June. The command spent about $2 billion for training in the fiscal year that ended last September 30th, which was paid for through supplemental funding passed by Congress. The U.S. has trained about 19,000 Ukrainian forces to date, the bulk of them at the army bases in Germany. Altogether, the international coalition has trained more than 129,000 Ukrainians at more than 100 different locations around the world. So that 129,000 number is the number that have already been trained. There's not 129,000 more Ukrainians that are being trained by the West. So that's, very misleading statement right there in its own. The other thing to notice is that the fiscal year ends September 30th, and the budget for U.S. Army Regional Command Europe and Africa is going to run out by June. So that should give you an idea of how much more money they've been spending trying to aid Ukraine. There hasn't been no money flowing into Ukraine since the last package ran out. Essentially, the president has been dipping in to the army's current funding in order to give support to Ukraine over these last couple months. So I think that's kind of an important thing to note here. So, while Joe Biden and the current administration is committed to helping Ukraine, they're doing that through backdoor kind of I guess you could say kind of shady means. This is money that wasn't approved by Congress to be spent on Ukraine, but through this presidential drawdown authority, they're basically saying, well, we're going to use whatever money for whatever we want to do, essentially. And then they're going to, run their reelection campaign clearly based on the statements of the Biden administration on getting another large Ukrainian aid package put together. All right, guys, that is it for me today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and there'll be more next time.